All righty, Mr. Chairman, your show.
All right, let's call the meeting to order. And Councilman Griffin, I'm going to give you the pleasure to say a few words.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear Heavenly Father, we ask that you just help us make the right decisions, the decisions that you would make on behalf of the city. We thank you for this opportunity to serve. It is a wonderful opportunity that none of us take lightly. And we ask that you would help us make all of these decisions in your name. In Christ's sake we pray, amen.
Amen. Thank you. We have a motion on the September 13th minute.
So moved.
Properly moved, Dan.
Second.
Properly moved in second. Any questions on those minutes? Hearing none, all in favor, please say
Aye.
Aye.
All right, ayes have it. Down to temporary encroachments, Mr. O'Brien.
Sir, we're back on the agenda with these. We've been able to get back. We've lost all our clerical help over here, but with the help of the permit center, we've gone through. We have 12 this week. We have some signs, irrigation, and some fences. All have gone through the approval process and been recommended for approval. So we give this to you as information.
Okay, thank you, Mr. O'Brien.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Fountain, any public service update on the G? I don't see any, but anyway.
Mr. Ware, we don't have any at this time. I will let you know that, and the committee know that in the next month, we'll probably be bringing back the environmental service recommendations we talked to you about earlier. We've got legals looking at it now, and we'll be coming back to report that so we can start our education process that we talked about earlier this summer.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Look forward to that. Mr. Fountain, item H, King and Hughie drainage.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So item H is the recommendation to approve the fee amendment number 2 with JMT, Johnson, Merriman, and Thompson, an amount of $53,324.35. This is for construction administration, the CEI type services on the project. We're extending the service time for the consultant due to what are called no cost days from COVID impacts, which are built into the contract as a pandemic delay, basically from crews having impacts and suppliers having impacts. And also from the number of rain days, the excessive number of rain days we've had this summer.
So moved.
Get a motion on the floor. Properly moved and
Second.
Moved second. Mr. O'Brien, let me get the questions first. Is part of this reimbursable under the American Recovery Act or anything?
So this one is not, Councilman Waring. If there's extended delays, typically they're reimbursable under liquidated damages. This one's an unusual situation that both rain days beyond what is envisioned in a standard contract for rain days in a month, and then both in COVID delays as well, are what are termed as no cost days, where the contractor is not eligible for any carrying costs or administrative costs for those extensions, but the city is also not eligible to reimburse expenses from the extension costs that we incur from the contract. So both sides basically share the cost.
Okay, all right. Councilman Griffin.
It says on here that we have a multitude of different funding sources on this: Cooper River TIF, grant, drainage fund, CWS. It doesn't say exactly how this added cost will be applied. Will we be using a smorgasbord, all of those different places to kind of get this 53,000 plus taken care of? And how are we looking on how the money is being dispersed on this project?
Sure, it's a good question, Councilman Griffin. So the funding sources are what are set up for the project budget. This change is still within the original project budget for phase 1.
Okay, thank you. It's perfect.
All right, any final question? Call the question. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Item H2, Mr. O'Brien, Coral Reef Drive drainage.
That one's also.
I'm sorry, Mr. Fountain.
Councilman Waring. Yeah, no, it's okay. Thank you. So this is it's a change order on a small project allocation for Johns Island project work on Coral Reef Drive. It's a little bit different in that this isn't part of the original contract scope. Basically, when we were walking the site with the contractor to set up the original contract work, we had a number of the citizens come out and identify some drainage issues they had that were kind of undermining the road foundation nearby. It's a relatively easy section to tie into the project with the same construction contractor into the same drainage system that we're improving. I think it's a good decision to do it. It's likely to save more than this amount of money in the next few years just in trying to protect that section of asphalt that's currently being damaged.
Sure.
So we're recommending approval while we have a contractor on site. They can basically just add it into the project for the $6,203.01.
Makes
Move
sense.
for approval.
Second.
Councilman Griffin.
Similar question to the last one. Is this part of the 2020 small projects list? And my other question would be, how much do we kind of set aside in case our small projects go a little bit over, such as this one? Do we have a $100,000 buffer or something in there just in case?
Yes, that's another good question, Councilman Griffin. So this one is the 2021 small project. The original budget was. This money is in excess of that off of the same account. What we generally do on this is we don't set aside a buffer, but because it's an operations account item rather than a drainage fund, it's on a like an annual pay-as-you-go basis. So basically we work through the money that's been allocated by the committee into those projects, but typically from a cash flow perspective, we don't spend out all of the money by the end of the year at the current rate we're going through. So we still have buffer in this year's money, and then next year those projects will carry over and more money will be allocated. But you're right, this is it is an additional 6,200 to what was originally envisioned by the Utilities Committee.
And the reason why I asked that is because I don't, we've done a lot of great work with this small project budget. And I know we put about $1 million aside. And I don't want people to think that because we're 6,000 over, that means that we're going to be 6,000 less last year. We're able to, this is a project that's going to roll over into next year. So, adding that 6,000 is not going to take away from one of the other small projects that we're doing in the city.
Yes, you're absolutely correct.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fountain.
Big question. Call the question. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. H3, update on Dupont Walpole drainage. By the way, I just sent an email to you, Mr. Mayor, and
I just read it.
yeah, and fellow council members about this. So, Mr. Fountain, update.
Yeah, thank you, Councilman Chairman. Let me pull up my screen quickly. I think it's a little easier visually to see this one. Such a large basin, it can be hard to follow sometimes. Let me shift this out of the way so I can see. Okay. So this is just a brief update on where we stand on the Dupont Wapu Drainage Improvement Project. And Mr. Chairman, I can actually give you a quick update on the area that we're talking about in that email separate to this as well, as I've been talking to the county about that area for the last few months. But obviously the Dupont Wapu project area is this large 1,600 acre basin, somewhat focused around the intersection of 526 Sam Rittenberg and Savannah Highway. We had identified previously, as you're all well aware, 11 total project areas, 10 of which are public projects. The 11th is actually located within the school property, but we did identify it as an area that there was a potential for drainage improvement. It's just all within the private school property or the public school property under the school's jurisdiction.
Before go back to the
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, you see the areas of 10 and 11, and
yes.
And then I guess the little at the base of 4, all those little yellow dots down there. I suspect that's Highway 6. Is that Savannah Highway?
Yeah, I can certainly provide a little more context here. Savannah Highway is sort of the large double line that runs
right
across the page here.
Well, my question is about that area below that. In other words, my understanding now is some of this area comes underneath Savannah Highway and eventually goes over by the mall and comes back underneath Savannah Highway out to the Stono. This area where 10 and 11 is.
So and I think, Mr. Chairman, I think instead of it being kind of over on 10 and 11, which is the Marsh outfall by Clayton Drive,
okay,
I think you're looking probably at this area over by the Ruby Tuesdays south of
correct
Highway 17. That's kind of just south of area 2 here, where the new Home 2 suites are.
Right.
Yes, yeah. And you're right, it's on the southern side of 17 like that. That area does sort of flow either north or south, depending on where the flooding is and where the drainage issues are. We've been looking at in this area with the county, series of a couple of different projects. One in Councilman Appel's district on some of the townhomes down here to add a little bit of storage and improve some of the drainage swale. 2, with the county to improve, there's an old railroad right of way that the city owns that comes through this area.
That's right.
We've been looking to try to share with the county where maybe the city provides some of the land since we own this right of way, and the county provides some of the work, and survey work is what they're doing now, as well as some of the construction work to clear some of the trees in the area and build more of a stormwater pond in that area to help manage this water in the short run. And then in the long run, potentially to install a new outfall along the greenway to take it down directly to that marsh outfall, and avoid, like you're talking about, this very circuitous route that brings it around through the mall, back down and around behind Costco and back again across 17 again.
That's the part I want to talk about. So you all working on that, keeping some of that water south and taking it out of the Citadel Mall drainage area, out of Dupont drainage area.
Yes, and that the redirection is probably a relatively long-term project because of how far it has to go on the greenway. We have to figure out where the CWS infrastructure is in that area. We're looking at sort of a midterm project to help add some storage into this area to at least slow that water down so it's not coming north and overwhelming the flooding in the Citadel Mall basin.
Okay, all right, well, thank you.
Absolutely. So we did advance from this original recommendation.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Councilman Shahid.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what you had pointed out, Matt. So area 3 is the Citadel Mall area. Am I reading this map correctly?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Okay. And so in answer to the chairman's question, this is going to improve that drainage area from what you just talked about, finding those other outfalls.
So yes, it gets a little bit complicated, but the if you can see my cursor, the water that is south of 17 here by the Ruby Tuesday, the Home 2 Suites where the bowling alley used to be, that water currently comes north and flows into the Citadel Mall basin towards this single outfall under 526. So all that water from down here comes basically all the way up, like Councilman Waring said, across 17, across Sam Rittenberg, under 526, back in front of Costco, down across 17 again, and then back out into the marsh. So we're trying to short circuit that flow path by potentially just bringing it down the greenway into the marsh and never having to have it travel through the rest of the basin.
Right, you see what we got, more water trying to get through that main canal at Citadel Mall, and if you can take some, I guess from a timing issue, water and keep it south, well, that's less competition trying to get to the bigger canal and eventually out to the Stono.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Mr. Chairman.
Right.
And that's been sort of the question, the $1 million question that I think that the developers over at Citadel Mall, the Epic Center, have been raising with that particular issue, if I recall that correctly.
Yes, yeah, they've brought it as well. They have a couple of different questions, but that is one of the areas that they've looked at.
Thanks for that clarification.
Okay.
So at this point, roughly a year ago, we did authorize and start design and permitting work on projects 1, 2, 3, and 4, project areas 1, 2, 3, and 4, which I'll highlight in a second, collaboratively with the county under a cost sharing MOA based on our relative jurisdictional areas within the watershed. These aren't the easiest things to see, but project 1 focuses on Orleans Road at the area sort of at the north end of the Citadel Mall, and the improvements here are mostly looking to provide relief to the Hazelwood, Taborwood area here that comes down through into this like large drainage canal through the apartment complex down here and then across Orleans and back behind the Citadel Mall. Those will tie into one of the other projects that we'll see in a second on the area numbers. Area 2 is sort of the area that parallels Savannah Highway. There was previously a round parking lot car dealership here that's been vacant for a little while. And that water flows from Dupont across through Orleans, through the town and country property, and then kind of up through a canal across 526, or sorry, across Sam Rittenberg, and then eventually into that Citadel Mall canal system. Area 3, this actually ties into area 1 that I talked about before. So area 1 was the improvement over on Orleans. That water then has to flow to the north of the Citadel Mall down by 526. This is improving the section that runs parallel to 526 to help the water get down to the outfall. We've been in quite a few talks with the Citadel Mall Epic Center developers about how this should look. We're looking at an open drainage system right now where we bring it into more of a, in the short term, like a big canal, then in the slightly longer term, working with the developers to build this into more of like an amenity / like recreational aspect for the mall property, where they could basically landscape it and beautify it and make it like a development draw to the mall property to have a beautiful outdoor water feature that runs through the parcel basically. Area 4 is actually the improvements on this mall property section here, adding some check valves and limiting some of the impacts when we get like major tide events that pull up into the system and eliminate a lot of that open storage capacity. So we do have preliminary design plans complete for all 4 of those project areas. At this point, we've been working with the county to review those design plans so we can return them to AECOM, but we're also, the initial design work showed that we were likely to need some drainage easement adjustments in projects area 2 and 3, which are again are the areas that kind of run. Project area 2 is the area that runs sort of from that round car dealership down through the town and country. And then project area 3 being the backside of the Citadel Mall. So those 2 areas, we're working with those 2 property owners to see if they'll grant drainage easement and shift easements around to be able to do those drainage improvements. We're also currently under a cost sharing agreement, again, with the county for the design funding on a 75-25 split. And now we've been starting based on putting together some of these design plans to look at what appetite and financial capability would the county have for a construction cost sharing agreement as we move forward.
Let me ask this. That's 75-25. How did we come, not y'all, but you met that, but I mean, how did we come up with that split? Why is it not?
Yeah, absolutely, Councilman. So that was based on both of these projects were being funded out of the utility accounts for the 2 entities, which need to be spent to like benefit ratepayers.
Right.
So we laid it out based on how much jurisdictional area each entity has within the Citadel Mall Basin. So the city has about 75% of the annexed area within the basin, and the county has about 25% in unincorporated.
That's what I thought, but really, I thought more of it was in the county than that. But anyway,
there's a lot of parcels in the county, but the area, a lot of it is in the city because some of the large parcels like the Citadel Mall and things are within the city.
Believe it or not, I get more calls from the people in the county with flooding problems, especially behind Mr. Mayor, 1 street removed from where your son lives, but directly behind St. Andrew's School. I forget the name. It's not 2nd Street. It's another street there. Well, you talk about flood. It's all in the county, right? It's really bad over there. I mean, and getting into people's homes, but anyway.
Our next steps on this over the next 6 months would be to finalize those easement discussions with the property owners. We've had a few meetings with each set of relevant property owners. We're starting to get there, I think. Then we have to prepare our permitting plans, submit them to DOT and the city and county permitting agencies. Over the next 6 to 12 months, finalize those construction plans and bid documents and see what funding the 2 councils will authorize towards construction.
So those easements, when you say we're in discussions, are we sending them letters asking them to sign off or for drainage improvements, or how's that play out?
They've been face-to-face meetings so far to discuss the options for one of the parcels needs a dedication of a new easement. And then 2 of the parcels probably need the easements to be realigned based on what the parcel owners want and what the city wants to accomplish as well, or the city and county team wants to accomplish as well.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you. Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Chairman, while we're on this topic, Matt, do you mind going back to the little diagram for area 2?
Yes.
I think that includes, it's close to the area that Mr. Chairman's letter is about. You may not have read yet, Matt, on LaSalle Street.
It's similar, Mayor. LaSalle is this area over here, kind of behind the school.
It's behind the school, yeah.
Yeah, we've been working, the county has been taking the lead on this area. As Mr. Chairman mentioned, most of these are county parcels.
Yeah.
The county has been putting together petitions along with some of the property owners in this area and one of the business owners in this area for acquiring easement where there are some missing easements so they can clean more of the ditch system.
I see.
And then the city, we had agreed to reach out, I think with Councilman Zachary, especially once the county's finished putting together the document for us, to the school, because there's also need for some easement through the school where the major canal runs kind of behind the parking lot that they built for the athletic stadium.
Mhm.
So really that little area doesn't need, wasn't identified for one of these projects. We just need to get better easements so we can clean out the ditches better.
So there are improvements once you get over to like project area 9, Mayor, but you can't do those improvements until you get the downstream improvements. So they would be in the next round of major projects. That's why the county and city have been looking at some of these shorter term maintenance oriented improvements to help out in the meantime.
Okay. All right, well, just since by coincidence we were on this area, it's nearby where the area where this letter asks us to address. I guess we'll have to get together with the county and sit down with them and just let them know what we're up to, and maybe they can help us get the easements we need.
Well, some of the people
the county's put I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
No, go ahead. But some of the people are willing to sign off on easements, but that's a little bit different when somebody comes out there and asks you to sign the dotted line. But anyway, hopefully they're going to be willing. Mr. Fountain and then Councilman Shade.
And I was just mentioning for that, the LC LaSalle area.
Right.
That we have found some interest in the property owners towards dedicating easement. Like you're saying, Mr. Chairman, it's not final until people actually sign the documents, but there has been support to get the survey work from the county surveyor to be able to prepare those easement documents. And they're just finalizing that now at the county. So hopefully we will have some success on that side of things.
Okay. Councilman Shade, you had your hand up a few minutes ago.
I did. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, would you mind going back to that slide before you return to this one, the very last one?
Was it one of the project areas?
No, keep on going. It had a narrative on it about city.
Oh, yes. Yep. So we had a design one and then we had a next step one.
Yeah. So, and I don't remember if you answered this from another question, but when you're looking at funding from the county and city level, is there a particular formula that you're using or that we use to kind of figure out how to prorate what government pays what amount on these projects?
So far we've been sticking with that overall ratio for the basin rather than trying to break it down into individual project areas, because most of the downstream projects, they don't have the full impact on the upstream areas. They still provide some relief to even the upstream areas. So I think we've all felt pretty comfortable about keeping that 25-75 split for the meantime.
Okay. Thanks.
Just to let y'all know, this area was on my list of requests to the legislature for their infrastructure funds, and I think it's in Representative Stavanakis's district. So, and I need to follow up with him as well. But if anybody talks to Leon, just let him know that we'd appreciate his help on some funds for this project.
Glad to do so.
Yeah.
Thanks for the heads up. Mr. Fountain?
That's all I had on this item, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for the update and putting it on the agenda. Barbary Woods Drainage Improvement Project.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me pull that presentation out. Let's see, where did I put that? So what happens, I have too many slides open. I need to stop that share. Cancel that. This, okay, there we go. So this is an update as well on the Barbary Woods Drainage Improvement Project. And this one, we've finished the preliminary engineering work, have some recommendations, and are looking for options on how to move forward. So this one's a little bit different in that Dupont Wapu, we funded all the way through final design and permitting for those first 4 projects, but not yet construction. Barbary Woods, the council has funded through the concept and preliminary design work, basically building the hydrology model, figuring out what the project would look like, but not yet through final design, because we knew that there would be a significant component of property acquisition in this project, rather than looking for something more like gratis easements that we are in the Dupont Wapu project. Now I'm going to just give you an update on where we stand with this one and see what the committee's recommendations might be for moving forward. So just as a quick refresher, Barbary Woods is on Johns Island. It's basically the homes on the northwest quadrant of Maybank. Maybank running is Highway 700 here, and River Road running somewhat north-south in the area. So you'd see the bridge over to Johns Island if you kept going this way just a little bit. And the new Pitchfork Road is actually shown kind of right here is where the northern Pitchfork would go. So this set of neighborhoods in here, when we talk about Barbary Woods, these are the impacted neighborhoods. The main neighborhood itself, when we talk about Barbary Woods, is this Hickory Knoll, Split Hickory Court section in here. But the overall project area is about 400 homes, mostly single family with a mixture of apartments in this one development. 250 acres of land, few undeveloped tracts still, especially in this section near the corridor and a little further down Maybank. Yeah, the primary issue on this project, and we'll see some pictures in a minute, is not so much structural damage. Interestingly, it's very long duration flooding of roadways. Most of the roads were built very low in this area, and they'll stay flooded for quite a long time after rainstorms. So what we did over the last few years is we originally started with a very brief concept plan just to kind of do some basic modeling and see what might be some options out here. That was performed by Davis and Floyd a few years ago. Based on that work, we went out for an RFQ, hired WK Dixon, teaming with Biohabitats, but WK Dixon's the prime on this project, to come back, reassess that H&H model and do a preliminary design evaluation for what level of improvements we could see and what land acquisition and cost would be necessary. So this is the results of that preliminary engineering work. Just again, for a little more background, this is kind of a zoom in of the Barbary Woods neighborhood itself, showing in blue the typical flood locations from a what we would call a 2-year storm, a storm that would occur on average every 2 years would result in those roads being inundated. You can see the pictures on the map of past flooding events. These started all the way back in 2008 with some of the neighboring developments. And there's a whole history we can get into of why it floods if we'd like to, but it floods pretty badly. Here's some close-ups of the 2008 rainstorm. It was kind of one of the kickoffs that got some attention to the neighborhood. 2015, it's worth noting this top picture is during the rain event, which is not good, certainly, but 2015 was pretty catastrophic. The bottom picture is 2 days later, 2 days after it had stopped raining. Still, the water is still too deep to drive in and out of the neighborhood. 2017, similar types of flooding. 2018, heavy flooding. 2021, this was the 2-inch rainstorm that we had in July. Closes the street. So it's again, it's not so much the property damage, which is a little bit different in this neighborhood. It's the inability to get vehicles in and out of the street or in and out of the neighborhood. We did take a look at multiple scenarios because there's no easy project to improve this area, unfortunately, because of how large the drainage basin is and the way it's set up. What used to happen is the water would come kind of through this blue area, this blue wetlandy area, flow down through the Barbary Woods community, through the neighboring community, kind of turn the corner through all these wetlands, come up through these developments, and then eventually go north. That was, of course, before any of these developments were built. When Barbary Woods was built, they basically kind of choked off, to some extent, that water flow, which dried out the downstream areas enough that a number of developments were permitted downstream. And most of this was done under, prior to the city having a stormwater, not only a stormwater department, but a stormwater manual. Most of this was still being evaluated by the state, but it's the kind of thing we talk about when you look at these basin scales instead of at neighborhood scales. The problem now is that the easy answer you would think would be to just improve the pipe sizes under Hickory Knoll and let the water go. But what happens then is you actually end up flooding out all these downstream neighborhoods that have been built since then if you restore the original drainage pathway. So you don't have that option. So we did look at that option. It does not work. It floods everyone out. The second option we looked at was basically realigning the stream in two different ways. One kind of takes it up and through this large vacant parcel to the north, which we'll talk about in a minute. The other takes it through the hickory knoll, split hickory of Barbary Woods, and brings it up between the developments to try to minimize impacts to the vacant parcel. We call that the retreat alternative because it's coming through the flooded homes and streets. In the retreat alternative, which we do not recommend, you'd end up obtaining between 14 and 21 properties. You'd end up having to demolish between 13 and 18 single family homes, which would definitely require eminent domain. You'd end up doing a partial acquisition of the heirs property tract up here, which we'll talk about. You'd have to probably move or major reconstruction on the CWS pump station that's down here serving these communities. So you're going to end up with a project cost of somewhere between 25 and 30 million, plus all the residential property impacts, which we decided we recommended this against this. We thought it was too large of an impact, both from cost and from non-cost impacts.
We still talking about Barbary Woods?
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
So that was what we would call like a retreat analysis for Barbary Woods. If you were to say, let's focus the impacts on the Barbary Woods neighborhood itself, since that's where most of the flooding is occurring. But it's a very large impact on that community, one that we think is too strong an impact. So the other approach that was the recommended approach that W.K. Dixon came up with is this natural restoration project, somewhat similar to what we've been looking at in Church Creek and Councilman Griffin's district. So this is basically, again, taking that waterway and taking a section of undeveloped parcels through here. And we'll look at the property acquisition in a minute. A piece of this larger undeveloped parcel through here, and then reconnecting and basically building floodplain storage through these parcels, as well as a renaturalized stream to convey that water. So the floodplain storage prevents you from flooding the downstream properties because you can store the water on the property while still only releasing water at the speed it's currently going through that community. And it also basically lets you redirect the water around while still having some water that flows through. So you kind of get the best of both worlds from a conveyance, how much water is flowing, as well as the storage.
How big a tract is that land you're talking about?
Yeah, well, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail, Councilman Warren, but this large section up here is about 20 acres. This section here is probably another 5 acres. So it's
Listen, I don't know about the rest of y'all, but your little icon isn't coming up on the thing here.
I was going to say, when he says this area here and this area there.
You see what I do on this side? Is that easier?
Yes, thank you.
So this one, I've got two different screens, and one shows my view of the presentation and one shows what the presenters are seeing. It's always hard to know which one is showing.
Well, we can see you now. Okay.
Yeah, so this
Now,
that helps. This larger tract here, and we'll have a zoom in on this, but is about 20 acres of acquisition. This smaller section over here is a few different tracts, is about 5 acres of additional property. And we'll kind of pull up what that looks like in more detail. We're just trying to show kind of the overview here of
Sure.
what the park, kind of a park setting would look like here. So again, just zooming in on what it looks like, there's some neat engineering features kind of how you would do the floodplain control and what it would look like. But I can talk about these in more detail if anyone wants, but basically just showing it's a naturalized system rather than like an engineered pond. We looked at this and said, you could acquire slightly less property and just build this as a giant pond in a dirt canal,
Right.
but you lose most of the secondary benefits of, kind of natural preservation and passive park space for people to go walking and birding and fishing and other things that we were trying to keep in the project.
Right.
So we looked at what the improvements would be for this approach. So these graphs get a little more complicated, and I'm just going to touch on them briefly. But what we're showing here on the left is how high the flooding gets. The dashing on the bottom is basically what the road elevation sits at. So when the graphs come above this kind of brownish yellow dash, there's flooding occurring. So this is a 50% storm, which means you have a 50% of that chance of that happening in any given year. So a 2-year storm is the other way to think about it. The current conditions are in red. So currently you get about 13 hours of flooding, and that flooding is roughly 2 feet deep right now in the peak parts of the storm. So the improvement project we're looking at, you would still end up with almost a foot of flooding, but it would be reduced to only be an hour or two long. So just during the peak of the storm. And kind of here's a graphical look of what that looks like in existing condition and improved condition, where we basically go from like kind of widespread flooding in especially this yellowish color is kind of the worst flooding, to taking most of the flooding out, even in a peak condition. But there is not a complete removal of flooding from this project. The roads are that low that there's no way to completely get water off the road. We're mainly looking for that reduction in how long the water is on the roads, so that you can get people in and out of their homes to get food and groceries and have emergency vehicle response. So
I'm just curious, what's the elevation of that road? That road.
So this is one of these interesting things. Councilman Waring, most of this area is at elevation like 20. It's a localized low area versus everything around it. So it's a bowl basically within a high area.
Yeah. So how could we have avoided, I mean, hindsight being 2020.
Yeah.
Given our drainage manual today.
Yes.
Developer comes in with a situation like that. What would happen?
Yeah, so that is one of the big differences. Zooming all the way back out without trying to make everybody sick, to what this looks like. So what happens now is if you come in to develop, say, this parcel here, you have to model what does the watershed look like, not just how much water is my property generating and making sure it's the same before and after development. Before it was how fast you discharged off your property before you developed and after you developed. Not how much water, but just how fast did the water come off at its fastest time. But what it didn't look at was like, well, how did water flow through your development? So for this development, they were able to put that pipe into the existing drainage system and then discharge their water out the back of the drainage system. But they didn't look at, well, how much water is trying to get through that road they built. So there was no evaluation of what would that pipe do to the overall basin.
Oh, gotcha.
There also was not an evaluation of you're releasing the water at its fastest point at the same speed, but you're releasing it that fast for much longer. So you're generating much more water. So that we now also in these areas of known flooding make them restrict how much total water they put out, not just how fast they discharge the water. So it's the difference between looking at how do I keep my own site from flooding basically versus how does my site not worsen flooding within the watershed.
Okay. Gotcha.
And the new manual is exactly designed to stop this kind of thing from happening. So again, looking at the storms briefly, this is this 10% storm, currently 17 hours of flooding. We're reducing it down to where you're only seeing peak flooding for a couple of hours, and then it tapers very quickly off from that. This is the hurricane event style storm, a 1% storm. Again, you're still going to see some flooding, but in the peak previous flooding, you're looking at 3 to 4 feet in the deepest parts of the roadway out here, which is where you're seeing it almost come into the houses in those pictures.
Right.
We're looking at diminishing that significantly, where you're no longer threatening the houses, and you are having, again, draw down from that flood depth very quickly rather than having these long extended floods. Here's a couple of pictures just of what it would look like on other example sites. And we're all familiar with kind of the beauty of Charleston, of the rural areas of Charleston. So we're trying to bring some of that back into this area. Real estate requirements. This is what you were asking about, Councilman Waring. So there are a series of parcels in phase 1, which would be the red. The largest parcel here, this is one of the more difficult properties in that it's an heirs property tract. There is a single homeowner on the tract now. You can see the front section. The current proposal leaves the front 6 acres of the parcel in the hands of the original property owners, including where the homestead is, and only takes kind of it's only, but the back 20 acres, which are mostly wetland and lower lying areas. But of course, that's going to be a difficult process and involve a lot of negotiation and trying to figure out what we can do with the family to see if that'll work. Understandably, I think the family has concerns about it being their property that gets impacted. We've looked at a lot of different approaches. Unfortunately, they're not wrong in that to some extent it's the only parcel left to work on. That they're sort of, you can look at it as they feel, I think, a little bit like they're being punished potentially for all the development that cities allowed in the area, and that's not incorrect. The reason that we're choosing it, though, is not because it's an heirs property, but because it really is the only parcel that's left undeveloped. And we're doing as much as we can in the upstream sections that are on other parcels, but there's just only so much water we can store in this area. Most of that flow has to come through here. That's why we did look at the alternatives analysis through the developed neighborhood of how many homes we'd have to impact. And that's why we still recommended this approach, is you'd still end up with a acquisition on the heirs property for that last part of that conveyance, and you'd impact probably 16 to 18 occupied homes, which are something we always try to avoid. But there is HOA property within here. These properties, these long, narrow strip properties, front on Maybank, we're only looking at basically there's a wetland that runs through the middle of those properties, basically taking the wetland and then a little bit of highland in the very back of those properties, which is a good double benefit for preventing someone from basically filling that wetland and then developing the backside of the properties as well. But it still saves the kind of the high value, high use portions of the property along Maybank for development. We don't end up getting into those portions of the property. So again, this is the proposed design that we were recommending. Still has 9 to 10 total properties of acquisition. We do say that eminent domain will be involved because with an heirs property, there will be a condemnation or eminent domain action for title, even if we can come to a friendly action where everyone is in favor of the approach. This avoids any direct impacts to homes. Again, it has a negative of partial acquisition of one of the heirs properties. It does have a positive, providing about a 25-acre ecological park, which obviously has some benefits in the area. We also do reduce flooding on the upstream and the core of the project corridor without any significant downstream area impacts, which is important. There's no utility impacts, no major impacts to the CWS pump station or the other utilities in the area. Still an expensive project. Looking at, and again, everything right now is very fluid with the construction market. We're looking at something like 9 to 11 total $1 million of project work. Real estate alone, because of some of these large property acquisitions, will likely be, somewhere on the order of $2 million, with construction being another 7. Phase 2 is an optional phase. It adds some additional benefits, but isn't required to avoid downstream impacts. That's basically, you can see in brown here, basically building a better curve and adding some better ecological features into this section that we don't have to do. Is a lot of earth moving for that, which is why the cost is so high. And then adding some other land in here with some of the additional HOA properties to store some additional water and kind of do some more natural landscaping. Those are optional. We'd probably look for grants for those if we were to move forward with that, since it's not a core part of the project, and see if we could get funding from grant agencies for that type of work.
When you say earth moving, Mr. Fountain, you mean just mining dirt, just hauling it out?
Pretty much, yeah, you're exactly right, Councilman. And so just to add more storage in, you basically just be hauling that dirt off of the site to create that curve. So there's a cost there, but sometimes, depending on what we can do, we might also be able to find someone who needs the dirt for something else and reduce our cost pretty significantly if we don't have to, what we call wasting the dirt, of basically taking it somewhere and dumping it.
Right.
You have to be a little bit balanced with that, because if you sell the dirt, you become a soil mine and you have to go through different permitting sets of hurdles, but there's some options if we can find a beneficial use for it.
Right. Okay.
So basically, what we're sitting at now is we need to figure out at some point what our property acquisition authority will be, and that'll be a question for real estate committee and then the whole of council. We need to go through the design review committee for the approach we're looking at because of the park style setting. We have to get into a detailed design contract with the engineering firm and work on our negotiations and real estate acquisition in support of that work. 1 to 2 years out, we'd be looking to complete that detailed design, get through our permitting work, which is somewhat complicated. It's all restoration, so it's generally well received, but there's some complications to it to make sure we're showing no negative downstream impacts, that kind of work. Finish up real estate activities, and then in the next 2 to 4 years, basically get through our finish our permitting to be able to build the project and get construction going. So it's a large scale project, a lot going on. I think there's some great grant opportunities if we decide to move forward with this, but it is a project that, unlike some of our projects, has a clear positive and a clear negative to the approach. So we wanted to present this to the committee and see what y'all thought about what we've looked at, see if you had any recommendations, and then depending on what the discussions are, see if we wanted to move this forward to real estate committee, which would take a little bit more work still on looking at potential property acquisition support so that we could go back to reaching out to property owners and look to try to make some more progress in those negotiations.
Councilman Shaheen.
Thanks, Matt. Would you mind going back to that screen that had the properties in that red shaded area?
Yes.
Right here. So the properties, the 9 of 10 properties that you are proposing that we obtain, but maybe by eminent domain, which ones are those again? That the ones in the red?
So the red is phase one. Those would be the
Okay.
phase one properties that we have to have in order to make the project work. So there's this larger parcel here, which is the Ayers property. It's about 20 out of the 26 acres. There's a couple pieces, I think, from the HOA in here, which the HOA has said from Barbary Woods that they'd be happy to gratis grant. I mean, again, they have to actually do it. Nothing's final until it happens, but they clearly have a stake in reducing the flooding. And then there are 3 properties along the Maybank corridor. I believe these are all owned by a single owner, if I remember right. It's the back half of these properties.
Are those properties subject to being developed, or are they just wetland areas that will never be developed?
So the front of those parcels is certainly likely for development. There's some slightly higher area along Maybank. It has frontage along Maybank. Let me see if I can switch to a different picture again. Sorry, I'm trying to make everyone sick. So this blue shading through here, Councilman, is basically where the wetland sits.
Okay.
So you can see there's some frontage on those properties that
Yeah.
are probably pretty high quality. There is a wetland, and then there's some slightly higher area in the back if you get across the wetland. So what we would look to do is basically start the acquisition around where the wetland is and say, well, we would take the wetland for storage, and then we take this higher area in the back to basically dig out and turn it into wetland and make it part of the storage on the project. So they are acquisition, but they're less expensive acquisition, both to reduce costs to the city, but also because the planning department has shown a preference for trying to get some development along the Maybank corridor here to provide services to the citizens on Johns Island.
So the funnel, the property that fronts Maybank may still be available for some level of development.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the developments you do see on Maybank tend to be pretty shallow developments because of that wetland to the back. So it'd just be, these parcels are pretty narrow generally. Instead of it being a long, narrow property, which you typically see is 2 or 3 of these being combined together into building a property along the front of Maybank, development along the front of Maybank.
Yep. Okay.
Which is likely what the current owners are thinking of, I would imagine.
That helps out. Thank you.
And we wouldn't necessarily expect, you certainly never want to go to eminent domain. We would hope we could negotiate a reasonable agreement with the property owners for these. We've done some initial appraisal work on some of these parcels, have an idea of what we're looking at on some of the properties. I think there's a route when we're trying to acquire wetland and kind of low line back areas. And remember, many of these parcels end up being very hard to develop right now because the area is so badly flooded that when you run your modeling, it's very hard to make your stormwater work on the parcels. So there is some benefit to the vacant properties in the area that they're easier to develop once you don't have quite as bad a flooding situation as well.
Mr. Mayor.
Matt, you mentioned the blue shaded areas, the wetlands, and if that's the case, it doesn't look like that Ayers property, the bigger one, doesn't have a lot of wetland. It looks like a little smaller blue area there.
Yeah, we have some more detailed wetland work for that one, Mayor, that I don't have pulled up here, that there is more wetland on that. I think this was if I remember right, this is I'm blanking on the name, basically the national wetland database that the US government maintains.
I see.
We have done a little bit more field level research in the area where we think wetlands actually are from the aerial photos and from the ground elevation. So there is more wetland on this property, but it's certainly not all wetland. There are high spots as well.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
if I may interject, I certainly like the concept of, you know, when I see the drawing, I think it's the next slide. You know, it appears as a park. I think it could be an amenity to our citizens over there and have trails and some exercise component and natural component. You know, so that certainly seems preferable than taking 16 homes out and at the same time utilize some almost make another park for Johns Island. It almost made me wonder a minute ago, thought went through my mind whether once we got it under contract and all, whether we could even apply for some Greenbelt funds to help pay for it.
thinking the same thing. I was thinking of that, Mr. Mayor, and also I was wondering, Mr. Fountain, you know, when you create wetlands, what is it? I only know a little bit enough to be dangerous, but isn't it sometimes you can get credit or something like that, or maybe you can sell credits or something for creating, mitigating wetlands?
You can, Mr. Chairman. There's a few options for it. You can actually create a formal bank that is basically eligible to sell the credits, or you can use them as credits on your own project work if we have projects that need wetlands. So that, or we could partner with another entity where we were to create. There's always a balance in that we want to make it an overall benefit rather than like necessarily a zero trade-off. But I think there are some options to either reduce city costs on another project or to look for some partnering where we might be able to do some kind of public-private partnership and get some cost offset for that as well.
Keep our ear out for that. Mr. Councilman Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fountain, this has a lot of similar aspects to sort of what we're trying to do in Church Creek and the ecological park design, acquiring land. You know, maybe we can, have we looked at applying for maybe another National Fish and Wildlife grant or some of these others? I'm just wondering exactly how you want this committee to move forward. Are you asking for our endorsement of this plan, and are we appropriating any funding at this time?
So we're not looking to appropriate funding at this time, Councilman Griffin, sorry. That we are looking at your kind of questions, Nora. I think you're right that the NIFWF grants, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grants, are one of the most likely, most appropriate sources for this. There also are some conservation bank funding type grants, not so much for the heirs property, but for some of the non-condemnation oriented properties that may have some real benefit here. We've talked a little bit, not with project specifics in fairness to anyone, but with some of the other advocacy groups like Ducks Unlimited and some of the other groups that are kind of strong advocates of preserving native habitat in areas near but not in urban areas like Johns Island. And I think there's a lot of interest in support for this approach to a project, not necessarily, again, this particular site specific area, but I think there are some great funding opportunities that we could look for to move the project forward. What we're looking at right now from the committee is first for input on the project approach itself. And then second, the next step would normally be to go to real estate committee with some recommendations for property acquisition and to see if there are any recommendations towards that action from this committee, since it's coming, we want to come through Public Works Utilities Committee, since it really is a stormwater and public works style project, especially with it, obviously being a more sensitive project with potential eminent domain. We have a number of ideas. One of them, some of the ideas, for instance, would be, there's always options, right? To acquire the property rather than to purchase the property, to look at potentially purchasing an easement on the property, like a recreational and drainage easement, where the underlying property perhaps could stay in the original family, but there would be access rights for people to come on the property, maybe with some limitations for, not having it. I should say, putting limitations on to try to protect it from unrestricted development, let's say, or redevelopment by the city. Because if we acquire a property, then sometimes there's a concern that the city may do things to that property that are not the original plans for the property, right? If we come on and purchase it, we could later turn around and put tennis stadium, put a tennis courts on it or do something like that. Where if we came back and said, look, we want to make it a preservation property, put a conservation easement on it, do something like that, there might be more interest in acquisition. I think we want to maintain the recreational aspect use from a passive recreation for a park approach and wildlife and fishing and birding and that kind of thing. But I don't know that we need to leave it as a completely open-ended property usage like you would get in a normal eminent domain situation. So that might be something that we would recommend at a staff level. I think something like a conservation easement has a lot of value. That might open up some greenbelt funding opportunities, some of that kind of thing. I think there's some real value here in eventual development offset. This is obviously an incredibly high demand development area on Johns Island, but it's an area that's been suffering from overdevelopment, from flooding and from other challenges. This is actually one of the corridor options for where 526, some of the off ramps for 526 come through this parcel. So there's also the potential. I mean, this is seen as in a lot of different areas as a likely property to be developed or used for something else. So there's some options here to try to protect it and preserve it while still leaving the frontage land for the different property owners and the usages envisioned by the city zoning. So that's kind of what we're looking for today, is to see if there's any direction along those lines, if there's anything that the committee would like to see us do before we go to real estate. If this is a good starting point for real estate, if we should continue negotiations, if we want to move to saying, yes, this is the project approach we want, let's go forward with an eminent domain authority. There's a lot of different options of how we move forward.
It's the pleasure of the committee.
I have a follow-up question, Mr. Chairman.
Councilman Griffin?
You said that this is a parcel that could be used for off-ramps on 526. How does that play into this project and our proposed design? If we acquire this land and do this natural restoration, could that negatively impact the completion of 526?
So it was one of the original alternative proposals. There's a whole series of different alternatives of the 526 option. It's not, my understanding is it's not their preferred alternative, nor is it the one they've kind of selected as their selected plan. But it was an example kind of what's being looked at for these types of parcels in the area. So it shouldn't have any impact at this point, Councilman.
Any other questions or observations? Well, let's entertain a motion here for Mr. Fountain, one way or the other.
And Mr. Chairman, that was the next item on the agenda, was basically if Public Works Utilities Committee was interested in recommending us to advance to Real Estate Committee to talk about property acquisition with the project.
So moved.
Second.
Probably move the second. Is there a plan, Councilman Griffin?
I just want to make sure that we're moving forward to real estate with the understanding that, we're not at this point putting any money towards it. I think there's a lot of different revenue sources that we talked about, grant applications, things that can be done. I would hate for us to put the cart before the horse and say that we're going to spend several $1 million that we may or may not have when there's definitely some funding sources out there. And I like your point, Mr. Mayor, about seeing if we can get some greenbelt funding. I think this could be a good opportunity for that. But at the same time, we're going to need to make sure that we're not going to be counteracting the completion of 526, because there's no way that Charleston County is going to support us if they're, for any reason, they feel like they could use this corridor as off ramps. But I still think there's a lot more questions than answers, but I really like the design concept, and I'd like us to send that to real estate. But I would hope that we wouldn't be acting on this too quickly.
And just very briefly, Councilman Griffin, there is a relatively significant amount of funding that had been previously allocated out of the drainage fund for the project. So we're not asking for any new funding at this point, because there's plenty of funding. I should never say that. There is what we feel like is beyond sufficient funding for real estate acquisition and design purposes in the currently allocated amount of money. Again, whether or not we choose to go forward with the project depends on whether we spend that money, but it is not any new allocation of drainage fund resources for the project.
Okay, that's a good point to note. Thank you, Mr. Fountain, for that.
Good clarification. Any final questions?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make clear, and I think Matt said this a minute ago, the current, Councilmember Griffin, the current preferred alternative by the SCDOT, I think they call alternate G or Plan G, and it would not impact this property on this side of River Road is not any impact whatsoever on the extension of Mark Clark. And I agree with you. We don't want to do anything that would interfere with that. But I just want to make it clear that this property would not.
Let's hope Plan G is the best plan, because I'd hate it if we got down to Plan Z.
Yeah.
G for good, G for
Yeah.
great.
Years old by then too. All right, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it. Thank you, Mr. Fountain. I mean, that was a really good explanation to a very complicated problem on it. Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
All right.
Chairman. I appreciate
Mr.
it.
Fountain, if you can send out those PowerPoints to the council members, especially for tomorrow night for reference.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilman Griffin. That'll be very helpful.
Okay, I do have a couple of housekeeping questions. So I'm circling back to, I think at the last meeting, I made mention about possible MOA agreement with Ashley Harbor with this, sucking out a drainage pipe or something. I don't know whether we had a chance to, legal or anybody had a chance to even consider that. But anyway, I kind of want to keep that until we get a definitive answer on that.
I can touch on that one very briefly, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
good.
So, Mr. Chairman, I did talk to the legal department about that idea. They basically did come back and say that it's very challenging due to the nature of how the private developments are set up and us not looking like we're basically using taxpayer funds to like subsidize competition against private contractors. I think what we can do, what we talked about, is we're happy to get them some contact information, help them find contact information for a variety of different contractors that they could use for that type of work.
Right.
And then, even have one of our engineers kind of explain to whatever contractor they select what they're talking about working on or doing. And that's likely to be cheaper for them probably than anything else would be. And I think the other concern, of course, is if any damage is done to the infrastructure, right, that the private contractors carry insurance for that, where the city doesn't generally insure in the same way. So we could kind of get into a spiral of liability on trying to repair
Very
something.
good point. You're right. You suck something out and something starts collapsing on you. Got a big expense. I hear you. Maybe we ought to kind of jot that down in writing, so I guess Councilman Shealy, others can sit down with the people in the HOA and give a better explanation.
Absolutely.
Madagascar was, over there at Ashley Harbor, kind of cleaning out the outfall, that kind of thing. Where are we on that? You're muted, Mr. Fowler.
Sorry, let me make sure I'm giving you the right update on that one, Mr. Chairman. Let me pull that up real quick.
Which one was that, Mr. Chairman?
Madagascar. It's a street in Ashley Harbor.
Okay.
Leads out to a little wetland marsh there.
So that one, Mr. Chairman, we have put in utility locates on some of the work over on Ashley Hall, Sandcroft, Madagascar area to clean out some of the drains coming to the outfall.
Right.
We have one of our crews scheduled to do the outfall work that we can do. And then we're looking at if that does not provide a lot of improvement, which I think that it will provide some at least, looking at potentially having some further clean out a little further into that Bulls Creek waterway as a small project for next year as well for consideration. If we can't get it cleaned out well enough that it helps the water start flowing better.
Okay, thanks. And the last one was Geneva Lake, that little pipe. I think we need to look down into that pipe. See what's going on inside that pipe.
Yes, yeah. So that one we have set up where we're trying to get one of our contract IDC companies to take a look at that. So we've reached out to a couple of our different IDC contractors for pipe cleaning, the indefinite delivery contract cleaners, to see if they can come and work on that one to see if our crews missed something or if there was something that they weren't able to get cleaned.
Okay. All right, that's it for me. Listen,
Mr. Chairman,
Councilman Griffin.
I meant to do this at the last meeting, but I want to give a shout out to Matt and Stormwater Police Department, South Carolina DOT. I was coming down Rutledge Avenue a couple weeks ago when we were in the middle of that big storm that we had rain like 3 or 4 days in a row.
Right.
A big sinkhole developed right there on Rutledge. And it took up almost the entire lane. And I hit it, and I hit it hard, so as soon as I hit it, I called Matt. I pulled over and I was trying to help direct traffic. everybody on our city staff jumped because there was so many cars coming up and down Rutledge at 5 o'clock. The DOT got out there, our police department got out there, Matt was checking the maps, looking for pipes. I mean, we really, really care about our citizens. I mean, just our staff, they never turn their phones off. They work after hours all the time. And within a few hours, DOT got out there, put a plate over it. They're going to place the road there and fix it. You know, that to me is a citizen service that doesn't necessarily make it in to our daily services. It's something special. But I mean, anybody could have hit that sinkhole at 40 miles an hour. If our staff hadn't have jumped up the way that they did and gone out there and corrected it, you know, we would have unfortunately had a dangerous situation. So kudos to everybody there. Matt, thank you so much. And CPD, SCDOT. That's just something I was really proud of how everybody jumped at that.
Thanks for sharing that one. Well, again, Matt, one of these days we're going to get you out to Hollywood and get you something that looks like an Oscar. Anyway, any final comments to the committee? I think we had a good meeting here today. I'm all in on questions. Again, Mr. Sutton.
Was it a collapsed pipe out there on Rutledge Avenue, Matt?
It actually ended up being some damage on a CWS manhole. So Councilman Griffin was our first report of the sinkhole. So he did a great job calling it in. He was the first person to report it. I got in touch with Mike Black at DOT, who, you know, same thing, responded after hours. I think it was on a Friday, Councilman, wasn't something like that?
It was after hours, but I can't remember. Yeah. It was raining.
He got his contractor to come out and plate the sinkhole because it's on a major DOT street, as Councilman Griffin mentioned. Frank Newham from our office and DOT met out there the next day, investigated it, determined it looked like a CWS issue, contact CWS. CWS came out and they're doing the repair work. So it wasn't, and CPD came out and blocked off the lane in the intermediary to make sure nobody hit it and damaged their car. So I mean, it was a really good team effort by everybody.
I wish y'all could have seen me out there in my vest trying to tell people to go around it, and they saw me and they're honking at me and screaming at me, and then they would go, "Oh, thank you so much." I was some crazy guy in a yellow vest, but
you didn't hurt your car, did you?
No, luckily it did not. But former Councilmember Jimmy Gallant hit it hard too, so he's trying to get it fixed. So, but luckily I think we avoided some serious damage, and that's because everybody jumped. I mean,
it was a good sized sinkhole.
It was.
Yeah.
You know, I do have final questions on that. Not on that, but Mr. Mayor and Mr. Fountain, you know, we got CWS meeting tomorrow. And remember that one word that they wanted shifted, I think, in some of our planning documents. And I know our staff was supposed to get with their staff. Where are we on that? Did we ever get with legal to kind of wordsmith that phrase?
Well, I understand that they just hadn't been able to schedule a meeting until recently, and the meeting is 1 o'clock tomorrow.
Okay.
Between our staff and CWS staff.
Is that verbiage in the planning document that we voting approval on?
It is, but we were going to meet with them and talk about it and see if we could get everybody's on the same page as what to do next. And like I said, they just haven't been able to get together. So they're doing that tomorrow.
Okay. All right. We'll stay tuned then.
Yep.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks. We had a good meeting by acclimate. Let's stand adjourned. Okay.
See y'all tomorrow.
All right.
Awesome.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.